So that you can understand a little bit more about this testimony that I'm going to give tonight, I've got to go back a ways and give you some history. Because there's a couple things that have gone on. And one of them has been a struggle, and another one is just, it's kind of been something that God has just done recently. My mother was not married to my father when I was born. Back in a little town in Michigan in that day and age, that was kind of looked down upon. And from what I understand, from things that I've been told, my dad, and I'm going to call him my dad, but he's never really been a part of my life. From what I understand, he was quite the ladies' man, and he liked to get around. I guess you could say he liked to spread the love around. But he kept, according to my mom, he kept telling her that there'd be a future and a life together, and kept making promises. So eventually, my two younger brothers came along. And I think I was in kindergarten, the last time I remember my dad coming to our house. And I didn't see him again for over 20 years. Now, we lived in the same town. I grew up in a little town in Michigan. We lived there in Michigan, my mom and my brothers and I, until I was halfway through high school. And all that time, my dad lived there too. And he never made any contact with us. What I've learned recently is that he was already married. And not only was he already married, he'd been married even before that. He had one daughter from his first marriage, and he had two girls in his second marriage. And so it gets kind of complicated, and I don't want to get bogged down in those details, but you need to understand that. The second father figure that I had in my life, he did eventually marry my mom. And it was through his job that we ended up moving to Texas. I really don't understand how this works, but my brothers and I, we seem to be good for him. He seemed to enjoy having us around. But see, he'd been married before too, and he was divorced. And he had 4 children by that wife. And when they got old enough to be a part of his life, my brothers and I found out that he really didn't need us or want us anymore. Now, experts will tell you that children form their opinion of what God is like on what kind of a dad they have. So, my dad kind of taught me that God was this person who would be there at the start, but eventually he'd be gone. He'd be out there somewhere. My stepdad taught me that God would be a part of my life as long as it was convenient for him. And then if he didn't want you around, then, he'd go on. Now, about the time I got out of high school is when I began my walk with the Lord. But one of the things that I really, really struggled with was this concept of God really loving me. A heavenly Father that loved me. it was just really hard to get a grip on that because, well, I didn't have too much luck with fathers before that. So, let me just pause here. If it had not been for my grandparents, my mom's parents, and their walk with the Lord, and I know my grandma could pray heaven down. I had the privilege of being there a few times when it happened. If it had not been for their prayers and their witness, and they were probably the most solid and stable force in my life, in my childhood, and in my teen life. So it was a lot through that I was, they always took us to church when we stayed with them. And it was through that witness of their life and their influence that eventually I got in church and got saved. So now I'm going through life and, I hear about this love that God has for us, and it's just really hard to comprehend. So while I was struggling with that, see, there was another struggle that was going on inside of me. And it was the circumstances that surrounded my birth. Because, children born to unwed parents, they got classified. I had an aunt that, and she's mellowed in her old age, I'm going to say that. But she had a way of making you understand your place and what you were. Later in school, I had a teacher that was able to do the same thing when she found out that my last name was the same as my mother's, because Mom wasn't going to give us my dad's last name because he wasn't there. So then there's this other little thing. If you read in the Old Testament, it talks about illegitimate children. It says they have no place even in the sanctuary. And Satan liked to use that one, beat me up with a lot. So there was this shame. And, for a lot of years, for a long, long time, I'm in my, seems hard to believe, about to be in my late 40s. So for a lot of years, I just didn't talk about that stuff. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit. September of last year, we had a revival at our church. It was centered around prayer. I think it was the second to the last night, the evangelist stepped out and he said, I just feel like I need to ask, is there anyone here that has a need and they want us to pray for it? Now, I wasn't the first one to jump up and go, yo, it's me. But eventually I said, you know what? All my life I've heard about this love that God has for His people. But I've had absentee fathers. I've had a father that abandoned me, and I just don't know that I know what God's love feels like. And so the church family gathered around me and we had a time of prayer. And that's a really good thing to do at church, because sometimes if your faith is weak, other people have enough faith to help get the prayer answered if yours isn't strong enough. But I didn't get up from there. I didn't, when everybody dispersed from around me, there wasn't all this warm, fuzzy feeling, and there wasn't, anything that I really felt like that happened. But one of the things that I do at work, and I try to stick to this It's almost every day. At lunchtime, get a half-hour lunch. I'm able to stay in my work area, and I get my Bible out, and I read. Sometimes it's one chapter, sometimes it's 2 or 3, depending on which part of the Bible you're in and how long the verses are. But I came across this verse one day, and I know that I must have read it probably a half a dozen times over the years because I've been doing this quite a while. It's in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 13. Paul's writing to them. And in the second part of the verse it says, "From the beginning, God chose you to be saved through the sanctifying work of the Spirit and through belief in the truth." And I kind of got hung up on that. Because I thought, the beginning? What beginning? What beginning is Paul talking about? So I kind of thought about that a little bit, and I thought, well, maybe it's the beginning. I know that probably sounds kind of funny, but I flipped over to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. We all know it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I flip back over to 2 Thessalonians. From the beginning, God chose you. And as my mind and heart was trying to get a grasp on that, I kept thinking, if it's that beginning, if it really is that beginning, what an awesome statement of love that God just made to me. We say that we believe that God is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. So if He knows everything, if He really is omniscient, how omniscient is He? Think about it. How omniscient is God? In Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10, He's talking to them about their idols and stuff, the things that they're worshiping that they shouldn't be worshiping. He says, "I make known the end from the beginning." There's that word again. "From ancient times, what is still to come." I thought, man, we've probably all heard the song about when Jesus was on the cross, I was on His mind. That's a great song. I believe that's true. But is it possible that before the foundations of the earth were laid, we were already planned? God's plan and design, His purpose was for us to be. That's love. That's love. I sat there that day as my mind was getting a grip on that. Tears running down my face, and you know what? I began to feel God's love. In February of this year, at the end of February, my grandfather passed away. Now, my grandmother passed away a couple years ago, and Grandpa passed away this last February. He was 103. Now, in the last 15 years, I've made a few trips to Michigan for different reasons. And one of the things that I usually like to try to do is make contact with my dad. Not that he's ever, really returned any attention. One of the reasons was because when I bought a life insurance policy, they asked me a whole bunch of family history questions about medical things, and you know what? I didn't know. So one of the trips we went up there and made some contact with him and asked him some questions. Sent some letters, sent some cards. After that, nothing. This last time when we went up, I called his house. And his wife answered the phone. I asked if he was there, and she wanted to know who was calling. But when I told her my name, she knew who I was. She was, how shall we say, less than friendly. But she did tell me that he was in the hospital. So I thanked her for that and told her, well, if he's in the hospital, then in the morning, my wife and I will go by and see him, visit with him a little bit, and pray for him. She said, some of my daughters might be there. Now, these are my sisters. These are my half-sisters. My mom had told us that we had sisters, but they were never told they had any brothers. So we got up the next morning, went to the hospital. No one was there but him in the room. Visited with him, prayed with him, left. I told my wife, I said, you know, I'm really kind of disappointed. Because you see, over the last few years, I've been kind of thinking, you know what? I don't care if my dad or my stepmom like it or not. I've got sisters, and I'd kind of like to make contact with them. So we left the hospital, not making any contact. Went through the day, went to the visitation that night. And towards the end of the visitation, a lady came in the funeral home. And I just happened to be walking through the foyer area with another friend of the family, and we were talking, and I overheard someone say, is Mark Laidler here? And I stopped and I looked. I said, I'm Mark Laidler. And she walked over in front of me, stuck her hand out, said, I'm Connie. I bypassed the handshake, gave her a big old hug. We both cried some. She told me that when her sister got to the hospital that somebody had mentioned that a Laidler had been there. Connie had been to the funeral home earlier that week and saw my grandfather's name, that his funeral was going to be later in the week. And so when all that transpired, she decided that she needed to find out if I was the one or not. And she decided that it was worth taking the risk of being rejected rather than possibly never knowing. We've been in contact almost on a weekly basis ever since at the end of February. It's been great. God's showing me His love, and I can feel it. In the 1st of June of this year, there was it was called a prayer conference. It was at the Nazarene Church over in Conway. And a bunch of us went, but Dave and I decided we wanted to get in on as much of it as we could because we couldn't be there on the Sunday morning. So we went, I think it started on Thursday night, didn't it? Thursday night, Friday, and Saturday. Morning, afternoon, evening. I guess I'm getting weird. Where God is, I want to be. And nothing against all you guys sitting on the back. I kind of like to be close to the fire. I just didn't sit there because I was going to get called up. I like to be close to the fire. So it was on Friday afternoon. The speaker said, you know, I wonder if there's anybody here that's dealing with some things and you just want to have God help you get free. Would you come forward? So I went forward because I thought, you know, I know there's a bunch of garbage connected to my life from way back. It's a lot of junk. Some people call it generational sin. Some people call it generational curses. Guys, the things you do, it'll affect your children even if they never find out about it. And there is an example in the Bible, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But I went forward. I began to pray. I said, you know, God, I know there's a bunch of junk, there's a bunch of stuff. Satan keeps beating me up with stuff. I want to be free. And the Holy Spirit said, you know, you've been carrying around this shame about who you are and your birth and all of that. And it's time to let go of it because that doesn't belong to you. But see, I had let Satan convince me that it belonged to me. And so there, in that time of prayer, I said, all right, God, I'm going to lay it down. So I laid it down. I said, you know what, God? If that's not mine, I don't want it anymore. You see, that shame was a lot like that chain that was around my neck. You couldn't always see it, covered up, but it was always there. You know, and Satan liked to come, yank on it a little bit, and remind me, and say, that's yours. I didn't know any better, so I believed him. But you know what? I don't believe him anymore. He's a liar. You know what? I could feel God's love even more then. When I got up from the altar then, I did feel different. I really did. It was like it was easier to stand up. Today at work, I happened to be passing by one of the ladies, and she was making an offhanded comment about her situation, and she's been divorced for a while now. Her husband drank, was into drugs, doesn't have anything to do with the kids. And I said, well, you know, because she said that she's not ever going to have anything to do with another guy unless she knows he'd be good to her kids. I said, you know, my dad was kind of like that. He wasn't around much. And I told her, you know, a little bit. She goes, you know what? I never knew that. I said, I know, I never talked about it before. God's been setting me free. My sister that I told you about, her and her husband were just here a few weeks ago in July on vacation. We had a great time. It was great. And I'm going to step out on a limb, but I don't think I have to be concerned too much. Because you know what? I believe that there's some of you out here that Satan's been lying to you about some of that stuff from your past. And it may not be a very distant past. I just want to encourage you. God is here tonight. He's been planning this. You're here because He wanted you to be here. They're going to give an altar call later, I'm pretty sure. Let Him set you free. Let Him set you free.